Title: The Leaking Tank, A Tale of Water, Wrath, and Wasted Towels. Gavel cracked with a sound like fate itself, a sharp, definitive report that silenced the low hum of the television studio and pulled every single viewer to the edge of their seats. This was the moment where ordinary lives collided with the uncompromising force of the law, presided over by the one and only Judge Judy, a woman whose gaze could dissect a lie from a mile away. Before her stood a family drama so bizarre, so steeped in a cascade of poor decisions, that it felt less like a small claims case and more like a slow-motion disaster, unfolding in a living room drenched in fish tank water. On one side of the imposing wooden divide was the plaintiff, a young man named Dustin Wolf. His posture was tense, a mixture of defiance and nervous energy, his eyes flickering between the judge and the man on the other side, the man who had given him life, his own father, Mr. Richard Wolf. The air between them was thick with more than just the sterile, conditioned air of the set. It was charged with the unspoken history of a father-son relationship, now fractured by a flood of negligence and a deluge of blame. This wasn't just about property damage. It was about responsibility, about the shocking moment when a simple leak spiraled into an epic family meltdown, revealing how a pinprick of a problem could, when ignored, unleash a tidal wave of consequences. Dustin Wolf, the son, had been a tenant in a small secondary house owned by his father, Mr. Richard Wolf. The two homes sat on the same property, close enough that a raised voice could travel from one kitchen window to the other, a proximity that would soon become a central character in the saga. When Dustin moved in, he brought with him a cherished possession, a massive freshwater fish tank, a shimmering, glass-encased ecosystem that was a world unto itself. It was a tranquil scene of gliding fish and bubbling water, a peaceful hobby that would, ironically, become the source of utter chaos. The crisis began not with a bang, but with a drip. Dustin Wolf awoke one ordinary morning to a nightmare for any aquarium owner. The tank, his prized centerpiece, had sprung a leak. A tiny, almost insignificant pinprick in the glass had become a conduit for disaster. But what Dustin did next, or more accurately, failed to do, would become the focal point of Judge Judy's relentless scrutiny. Instead of addressing the problem head-on a course of action, Judge Judy would later label as what most normal people would do. Dustin made a choice that set the entire calamity in motion. He prepared for his workday. Before leaving, his mind seemingly elsewhere, he performed what he believed was due diligence. He scattered a handful of towels, perhaps 4 or 5, around the base of the leaking tank, a pathetic moat against the encroaching water. It was a gesture so insufficient, so laughably inadequate, that it hinted at a profound failure to grasp the severity of the situation. Then, he made a phone call. He didn't call a professional. He didn't call his landlord, who also happened to be his father, Mr. Richard Wolf, living just a stone's throw away. No, he called his girlfriend, Ashley Ramsack. Ashley, a young woman who did not live with him, was now tasked with a bizarre and stressful mission. Dustin's instructions to Ashley were as simple as they were absurd. Come over to watch my leaky fish tank and see what you can do to keep the mess to a minimum. Imagine receiving that call. The confusion, the immediate sense of a problem being dumped in your lap. So, Ashley Ramsack entered the scene, walking into a home where the steady, metronomic drip, drip, drip of water was a constant reminder of a ticking clock. The day stretched on, an agonizingly slow progression of hours where the leak, patient and relentless, continued its work. Dustin Wolf was at his job, presumably thinking the situation was under control, while Ashley was left as a solitary sentinel guarding a losing battle. From 7 a.m., when Dustin left, until 5:15 p.m., when Ashley finally arrived after her own work day, the water dripped. For over 10 hours, the towels did their noble best, soaking up the moisture until they were saturated, heavy, and useless. The initial damp spot on the floor began to widen, a dark, spreading stain of trouble. When Ashley walked in, the scene was already well past critical. The 5 towels were soaked, and the leak was winning. She scoured Dustin's home for more towels, for anything absorbent. But he had left her with nothing. He had used every last towel in his possession in his morning rush, a fact that spoke volumes about his preparedness. This was the moment the first real flicker of panic must have set in for Ashley. The drip was no longer just a nuisance. It was a threat. The water had to be going somewhere, seeping into the floorboards, the subfloor, threatening the very structure of the home owned by Dustin's father, Mr. Richard Wolfe. Driven by this growing anxiety, Ashley Ramsack made a decision. She would go next door and appeal for help from the property owner himself, from Mr. Richard Wolfe. This was not a simple errand. It was a walk of shame, an admission that the situation was escalating beyond her control. She knocked on the door of the main house, and when it opened, she was face to face with Richard Wolfe, a man who was, in this context, not a kindly grandfather figure, but a landlord whose asset was being slowly waterboarded by his own son's negligence. According to Ashley's testimony, she asked to borrow some towels. She claimed that Richard's partner, a woman named Sheila, chimed in, suggesting that Richard might have some extra towels to spare. The critical question, which Judge Judy pounced on with the precision of a hawk, was what they knew and when they knew it. Ashley insisted they were aware of the leaking fish tank earlier in the day, but her timeline was murky, a fog of confusion that Judge Judy was determined to cut through. It turned out Ashley hadn't immediately rushed over upon arrival. She had waited. She didn't see Richard Wolfe until around 6 p.m., and even then, her request was framed as a future possibility. I might need some towels later, rather than the desperate plea. It should have been. What happened next defied all logical explanation and added a layer of surreal suspense to the story. Instead of declaring an emergency and demanding immediate assistance, Ashley Ramsack apparently fell into a casual social routine. She, Richard Wolfe, Sheila, and some neighbors ended up socializing. They were outside, chatting, perhaps enjoying the evening, while just next door, in Dustin Wolfe's quiet tenant house, an aquatic time bomb was ticking away. For 3 hours, from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., this bizarre backyard gathering continued. A picture of normalcy painted on the edge of an abyss. The image is almost comical if it weren't so maddening. Laughter and conversation floating in the air, all while a relentless drip continued its silent, destructive work inside. What were they talking about? The weather? Sports? Could the topic of the leaking tank, the very reason for Ashley's presence, have really not dominated the conversation? The suspense for the viewer is palpable. You want to scream at the television, to run into the scene and point at the house next door, to make them understand that every passing second was another drop of water, seeping into the foundation of their familial and financial stability. Finally, at 9 p.m., a full 14 hours after the leak began, Ashley Ramsack decided to check on the tank again. The scene that greeted her was the one she had, through inaction, allowed to happen. The towels were beyond saturated, the floor was a wet ruin, and the situation had escalated from a manageable leak to a full-blown crisis. The fish, the innocent occupants of this failing ecosystem, were now in active peril. This time, her return to Richard Wolfe's home was not a casual request for towels. It was a plea for a rescue mission. Sheila, perhaps finally grasping the gravity of the situation, urged Richard to help, saying, "Richard, why don't you go over and help Ashley?" This was the turning point, the moment the father was pulled directly into the son's mess. Mr. Richard Wolfe crossed the property line and entered his son's waterlogged home. He assessed the situation with the growing frustration of a man who knew this entire disaster could have and should have been avoided hours, even days, earlier. He asked for a hose, intending to siphon the water out of the tank to a level below the leak, a simple, effective solution that Dustin himself could have performed before he even left for work that morning. But what happened next was not a calm, measured fix. According to Ashley's emotional testimony, Richard Wolf's patience had snapped. The sight of the neglected tank, the hours of dripping, the sheer stupidity of it all boiled over. She claimed he got really upset, that he threw a water filter against the wall in a burst of fury and swept items from the top of the tank onto Dustin Wolf's bed. This was no longer just about water damage. It was about raw, familial anger erupting in the middle of a crisis. Despite this outburst, the practical work began. Richard started the siphoning process, directing the water out of a window, while a panicked Ashley, in a last-ditch effort to salvage something from the disaster, stood on a chair, desperately trying to scoop the 25 doomed fish into a cup, filled with their own contaminated water. It was a pathetic, frantic scene, the enraged father siphoning water, the terrified girlfriend trying to play hero, and the son, Dustin, completely absent, still at work. The climax of this aquatic tragedy was the death of the fish, a consequence that seemed almost inevitable after hours of neglect. The tank was drained, the floor was ruined,